Welcome everyone. This is another slideshow of work done on my 1949 AC 2 litre. The rear axle on my AC was made by ENV. Earlier ACs had a Moss axle. There is an important difference which can lead to trouble if it is wrongly maintained. When you check for wear in the bearings of an ENV axle, you need both wheels off the ground at the same time. This axle has a combined end float because the two half shafts touch in the centre and there is a tapered roller bearing at each end. The end float should be between 5 and 8 thou or 0.13 to 0.20 millimeters. I measured mine as 31 thou or 0.79 millimeters. This excessive end float causes more trouble than you might expect. Since the bearing had not been pushed all the way down the shaft, it failed to grip the distance piece just behind the hub. This distance piece was free to spin on the shaft, but what actually happened is that the outer oil seal held the distance piece stationary while the shaft span inside it. These parts wore against each other with no lubrication. Amazingly, there was very little damage. There were more horrors to be found inside, but firstly I'll deal with dismantling. Normally the axle is overhauled with the casing left in the car. You slide each half shaft out and then remove the diff. An 8 feet wide single garage like mine is not wide enough for this unless you can move the car sideways on a trolley. My garage has a pit, so it can't support much weight in the centre of the floor. For my car, I was removing the whole axle as part of the restoration. Usually this is very difficult. With the axle dismantled, you can pass the casing down under the car. In my case, I tackled this task while the bodywork was partly dismantled. With the springs removed, I could slide the axle across the chassis, allowing me to pull the half shafts out. You have to be careful not to damage the inner oil seals if you plan to reuse them. If you plan to give the differential any attention, such as a new oil seal, it is best to undo the nut holding the drive flange while the axle is fully assembled. The nut is very tight and you need to apply the handbrake while undoing it. In fact, my brakes kept slipping, so I locked them tightly with the adjusters. To dismantle, you remove all the brake components and then remove the 6 bolts holding the bearing housing. There might be shims under the housing. Oil had seeped out from between the shims on mine. You can then slide out the half shaft complete with its bearing assembly. Once both half shafts are out, you can unbolt the diff. Note that it is very heavy, so you will need something to rest it on as soon as you lift it out. I then lifted out the axle casing and removed the inner seals. I got the dirty work done firstly before tackling the overhaul. I repainted the casing and other components with the same paints I used on the chassis, namely epoxy mastic as a primer and 2-part polyurethane formulated for steel structures. I bought Jotun paint from a boat supplier. It is a very tough paint finish. The only drawback to Jotun's polyurethane is that brush marks are very bad. This doesn't matter for most areas on the car unless it's a show car. At one time I was using International Paint's version called Perfection. It is very expensive, but sometimes you get what you pay for. That paint flowed out like a coach paint for a lovely finish. When I say it's expensive, it costs 5 times as much as Jotun's paint. Preparation is vital. With the car service, wire brushing seems the best approach. Some words of warning about wire brushing. It can create a dull glazed surface over the rust. Using emery cloth afterwards will show if this has happened. Wire brushes also leave a glazed finish on the bare metal, which is not ideal for paint adhesion, so the use of abrasive cloth as a follow-up is a good idea. Like all the other black finished areas on the AC, the axle was coated in bitumen. Since bitumen has poor resistance to solvents and acids, the subsequent pre-paint treatments I always use help to remove the last traces of that original coating. I had some solvent cleaner left over from my crack testing kit and found that cleaning steel with this gave better adhesion. If you do use any solvent cleaners, it's best to follow it with a suitable alkaline cleaner, such as POR 15's metal cleaner. Finally, I applied a phosphating solution and after 20 minutes rinsed it with deionized water. I applied 3 coats of black epoxy mastic and 3 coats of the aforementioned polyurethane, 1 day per coating. When painting all these parts, remember that oil-tight joints are required between the casing, back plates and bearing housings. Now moving to some fun and games to remove the bearings from the shafts. Normally this is done with a hydraulic press. I didn't want to buy such a machine just for this one task. Since I have a large stock of BSF nuts and bolts, I decided to use some of them to force the bearings off. Firstly, unfold the tab washer and slacken the ring nut. The bolts on the housing can't be removed until the bearing has been pushed a short distance along the shaft. I used 6 nuts and bolts to push it a tiny distance, followed by slightly longer bolts. Once the original mounting bolts came out, I used long set screws. A close examination of the outer race of the tapered bearing shows this damage, either from the slack fit or maybe also from when it was installed. There were metal shavings on the ring nut caused by someone trying to use the nut to press the bearing in. The thread on the shaft has slots which cut into the nut if it is tightened too hard. The next challenge is removing the outer race of the bearing from the housing. The outer oil seal is also in there and you cannot extract it until the bearing race is out. ENV later improved this design so that the seal can be removed from the front. There are slots in the housing to allow you to insert a puller, but they are too small to be of much use. I decided to cut through the oil seal and chisel it out, thus gaining better access to the bearing. A big hammer and a soft brass drift eventually got the bearing out, being careful that it moves evenly. The original Timken bearing was part number 25578/25522. The new ones I obtained from Which Bearings, that's WYCH, are part number 25577/25522. The only difference is that the inside diameter is half a thou larger, but still an interference fit. Jaguars of the 1940s had ENV axles, and the bearings I ordered are the same as supplied for Jaguars. I couldn't find the original type for the AC. Next on the agenda is crack testing. Here I am tapping the hub, which made a nice ringing sound. Just to be slightly more scientific, I also bought a dye penetrant test kit from LAS Aero. I tested the half shafts, paying particular attention to the hub end and also the splined ends. For good measure, I tested the bearing housings. There's the half shaft part number. I don't know if it matches any Jaguars or if it is unique to AC. I can't tell by comparing the rear track of the AC, which is 4 feet 8 inches, to the various Jaguars because they have different wheel offsets. The original oil seals were leather, which would have to be soaked in oil prior to installation. I prefer to change to modern nitrile seals. They are easy to press into place. Here's me looking very professional again. This was back in 2014. I'm fitting the new outer race into the housing, having remembered to fit the outer oil seal first. I used a vise and plywood to get it part way in until flush. Then I used the old bearing to push it further, being careful not to get the old race stuck. That's how far it goes down. Now ready to reassemble the bearings onto the shafts. Here's the distance piece, ring nut and the tab washer, which still has some unused tabs. There's the distance piece inserted through the outer oil seal. Don't forget to fit the bolts before pressing the bearing onto the shaft. I found it convenient to bolt the shaft to a wheel. Slide the bearing housing along with the distance piece into place, then slide the inner race and roller cage as far as it can go. I then used a brass rod held against the inner race and hammered it evenly all the way around its circumference. The tyre absorbs the shock loads. I covered the bearing with newspaper to keep it clean. Make sure that the bearing is pressing firmly against the distance piece, and don't forget to put some high temperature grease in. Then fit the keyed washer, the tab washer and the ring nut. I don't have data for any torque setting, although being a thin nut and with the keyways in the axle thread, I doubt if the figure is very high. Finally bend a couple of tabs against flats on the nut. I did not attempt to overhaul the final drive. I checked the condition of the teeth and also measured the backlash. This is measured at the edge of the crown wheel. It should be between 5 and 6 thou, or 0.13mm to 0.15mm. If you want to tackle an overhaul on the diff, I would recommend getting a Series 2 or 3 AC handbook. The Series 1 handbook deals with the Moss box. I made my own gasket for the diff from 1/64 inch or 0.4mm gasket paper. The next stage was a trial assembly to check the end float and see how many shims were needed. I measured it using an internal caliper between the brake backplate and the back of the hub. Movement of the hub should be between 5 and 8 thou, or from 0.127mm to 0.203mm. If there's too much, then you can remove shims. If you need more shims, you might find them stocked by classic Jaguar suppliers. At last, the final assembly. I placed the axle casing back onto the chassis. The diff can be lifted on with the new gasket plus liquid gasket sealant. With new inner oil seals already infitted, I carefully slid the half shafts in with the back plates and shims. I made sure that the mating surfaces were clean and applied some gasket sealant under the bearing housings. These had leaked oil to a small extent previously. With the springs installed, I bolted the repainted U-bolts on. Ideally these should be renewed, but I could not find any. They are fairly thin at 3/8 of an inch with BSF threads. I fitted new nylock nuts. Finally I renewed the oil seal on the nose of the diff before refitting the drive flange and bolting up the prof shaft. I had already worked on the propeller shaft. There was slight wear in the universal joints and I bought a new pair on eBay. They were advertised with a warning that they wear out quickly. They did not have the greasing points that the originals have. Maybe that improves the balance. I'll see how long they last and, if necessary, add greases to any subsequent units. It might be prudent to get the shaft professionally balanced, or I might just see how it performs. One last detail for the rear axle. Fill up the diff with 3 pints or 1.7 litres of EP90 oil. EP stands for extreme pressure, which is needed for high-poid gears. At the time of making this video, I haven't run the car, so I might make updates on any issues that arise. New oil seals might fail if the car stands for too long, so I try to roll the car out of the garage regularly. Okay, that's all for this exciting adventure. Thanks for watching.